Good evening, afternoon, and morning, and welcome to the first Florence Live post-COVID conversations organized by the School for Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. And as much as I would love to be in Florence at the moment, I'm sitting in my home office here in Helsinki, and my name is Alexander Stubb. I'm the new director at the School for Transnational Governance. Today, we're going to be talking about democracy, and this is the first in a series of 7 webinars that we'll be organizing every Monday, usually around 5 o'clock Central Eastern European time. We will have 7 series. We'll have democracy in the first one, state versus market next Monday, climate the week after that, then digital, migration, Africa, and before the summer break, we're wrapping it up with geopolitical affairs. We have a wonderful set of discussants, of experts talking about these issues. I will begin by introducing them. The first speaker that we have today is Anne-Marie Slaughter, an international lawyer and political scientist, joining us from the United States of America. And of course, we all know that Anne-Marie has taught or studied at Princeton, Harvard, Chicago, and Oxford. She actually is the CEO of New America, one of the greatest foundations in Washington. So warmly welcome to you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks.
Next in our roster, we have Kalypso Nicolaidis, who is a Greek-French academic and commentator who has also either studied or taught at Oxford, Harvard, Sorbonne, ENA, Sciences Po, Bruges, and the European University Institute. So one could say that you, Kalypso, are by definition an EU supremo. And welcome to you, I assume, from Oxford.
Thanks, Alex.
And then finally, we have Ivan Kratzev, who is joining us from Bulgaria, Sofia. He's a political scientist and chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies, fellow at the IWM Institute of Human Sciences, and also a fellow at the Robert Bosch Stiftung. I would argue that by definition, Ivan is Mr. Democracy. And the 4 of us are here today to discuss. I am moderating, and then my distinguished panelists will be discussing. We will be having this panel in 3 parts. First, we will talk about the past of democracy. Then we will talk about the present. And finally, we'll talk about the future of democracy. And just by way of introduction, I had a feeling before the COVID crisis began that Western democracy as we know it was in some sort of flux. If you think about it, in the beginning of the 1900s, we had 5 to 10 democracies. Then post-Cold War, this number, of course, exponentially increased, and we would be looking at about 100 to 120 democracies by the turn of the century. But then we started, after the financial crisis, to see different types of movements to authoritarian states. Democracy wasn't what it used to be. And I'm reminded of Daniel Kahneman's wonderful book, Think Fast, Think Slow. And what he does is he divides basically things, or the brain and the way in which we react, into 2 parts. One is the quick one, the system 1, our emotional part, where we react really quickly. The other one is system 2, which is slow, which is contemplative and reflective. And I would argue that democracy was originally created for system 2. John Locke thought that democracy needs to be slow, whereas now we live in a Trumpian world where we have to react to things 7 or 24/7. So therefore, my first question to you goes my first question today goes to Anne-Marie Slaughter. What would be your assessment of the state of democracy in the cradle of democracy at the moment? In other words, the United States. What is it looking like over there?
Well, it is certainly looking much more like System 1 than System 2. I like that analogy very much. We are in the world of social media. More importantly, we're in the world of disinformation that is absolutely targeted and calibrated to arouse emotions over reason. And indeed, certainly the Trump administration and many of Trump's supporters, I would argue, have mastered that system much more than the Democrat side has. Indeed, you're seeing that right now with regard to the pandemic, where those of us who believe in science and health experts and very careful balancing of the competing interests, the economic interests, the health interests that you have to do to make good policy, are literally being swamped by finger pointing and rabble rousing, true rabble rousing. I mean, these pictures of people with guns assaulting the Michigan State House it would be out of a bad movie if we saw it on screen. Unfortunately, it's reality. So I would say right now, I think our democracy is resilient. The bright spots in the United States are many from governors and mayors and county health officials. Smith County, Texas, which is in Northeast Texas, the county and the city came together, created a joint command, have really managed to control the pandemic. There are many of those kinds of bright spots, but at the national level, our democracy is being sorely tested, and we are not seeing the kind of deliberation you need to respond to a pandemic like this.
What do you think the founding fathers would have made of this? I mean, if you were writing the Federalist Papers again now, Jeffersons and Hamiltons of this world, I mean, what would they say of this sort of cacophony of information and non-expertise that we're seeing in the American public discourse at the moment?
Well, I actually think they would be less surprised than most people think. One of the few more reassuring things to do is to read American history, is to remember that the first Alien and Sedition Acts were in 1800 under President Jefferson, the great founder of, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. There was all sorts of propaganda and really, really nasty stuff. If you read the biography of Hamilton that launched the musical, you'll see, Hamilton is attacked and he attacks Jefferson. So I do think that there have been moments like this before in American history. What is distressingly different is the combination of extreme polarization, rising inequality, social media, and a leader who cares really only for his own poll results and indeed himself. And that we've had many of those at different times. I'm not sure we've ever had them all together.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Ivan, let me move to you. I mean, you are, for all intents and purposes, the brainchild of a fairly new democracy, and you've been born there. In other words, Bulgaria. And you've written a lot about democracy, about liberalism and the demise of the liberal world order. How would you sort of judge the state of democracy right now, more specifically probably in Central and Eastern Europe?
Listen, Central and Eastern Europe is part of the bigger crisis of democracy. Of course, there's specificity here and there, but one of the interesting stories about Central and Eastern Europe was that if 5 or 10 years ago, we're going to have a problem with democracy, we're going to say this never can happen in the US, or this never can happen in the United Kingdom. And now you know that this can happen. And from this point of view, this creates a totally different feeling of disorientation. And because for many of our societies, democracy was kind of the answer to any question. You ask people how you're going to get rich, and the idea was just get a democracy. You tell people how you're going to get a just society, and democracy was the answer. And now you have this kind of a feeling of betrayed expectations. But at the same time, in Central and Eastern Europe also during this crisis, you can see that while there is a major questions about democracy, and as you know, COVID-19 is very kind of a threatening for people with the preconditions, existing preconditions. So from this point of view, democracy was also a kind of a patient with pre-existing conditions. But the story was that also you understand that in Central and Eastern Europe, there is not a real alternative to democracy. A classical type of authoritarianism does not go. People are not interested to allow anybody else to decide who is going to be in government. And of course, because of many reasons, which are even now difficult to explain, Central and Eastern Europe for the moment has a quite lower number of infected people and people who are dying compared to some of the West European countries. So as a result of it, at least for the moment, this is not very much perceived as the major crisis of democracy. And even the Hungarian case that have been, the Polish case that have been very much commented, today Mr. Orban declared that in the beginning of June, his unlimited state of emergency and his unlimited powers are over. By the way, to be honest about Orban, I never understand why he did it. He had a constitutional majority, so he didn't need a state of emergency in order to do what he wanted. And in the case of Poland, nevertheless, that the governing party was very much insisting having the elections when the majority of the people were against it. You can see that they were forced by the public to cancel it. So from this point of view, I do believe now Central and Eastern Europe, at least in the time of crisis, rejoined the mainstream. The problem is that mainstream has moved quite a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. Clearly, I find it very difficult to be a moderator because I did forget, in the spirit of democracy and in the spirit of modern communication and technology, to remind everyone that we are on Facebook Live and we're here, and you can submit your questions to us very openly in the spirit of free speech. So shoot at us and we'll pick those on the way. Kalypso, let me go over to you. I mean, if you look at the European Union as a conglomeration, more than an international organization, less than a state, it quite often gets lambasted for not being a democracy. How do you counter that argument? Is the European Union a democracy, or what the hell is it really?
Well, indeed, we've been asking this question for a long time, Alex, haven't we? And it matters more than ever. As you were saying, if it's hard for governments to move from systems too, slow to fast, even harder for this very cumbersome animal that is the EU. And European citizens have noticed, I don't know if you saw this recent poll of young Europeans in their majorities thinking that authoritarian regimes are better than democracies at dealing with a pandemic or climate change or whatever. So the battleground that we're fighting on at the School of Transnational Governance and elsewhere is really one also of narrative to show that in this kind of mega collective experiment in comparative resilience, as Anne-Marie was saying, there is democratic resilience here. But is the EU really democratic, you ask? Is it resilient to this moment in its democracy? And I would say, if we're consistent with ourselves, we should agree that it's the citizens who can say that, because it's them who can say whether they still feel that they own the beast. And frankly, what we've seen for a long time is magnified today. That is that many feel, if not ambivalent, they feel no, okay, we understand that the EU is a table, so you can't throw all the rascals out at the same time, but it's worse than that.
One at a time, it's possible.
Only one at a time. So they're not collectively accountable as we have in a democracy. But worse than that, the EU has kept in its DNA its original sin, that it was an anti-politics invention against mass democracy for good reasons at the time. But now we're in the 21st century, mindsets have changed, technologies have changed, and yet the EU still has that DNA. But so you've got that story, but then you have another hopeful stories with citizens mobilizing and feeling that they do own the EU, sometimes in fact more than their problematic national democracies, as Ivan was saying, and that the EU, is a kind of transnational democracy in the making, constantly being invented, making mistakes, being slow and cumbersome, but having the ingredients of what I call democracy, union of peoples. That is there to make its national or even local, very important local today, national and local democracies more effective, more able to be appropriated by their citizens. But at the same time, these these circles, democratic entities, or states or others, talk and care about each other. That's
what do you think, Kalypso? I mean,
democratic interdependence is.
You've written a lot on Brexit, and of course, I mean, one could argue that the first major European movement that we saw, and not only in the United Kingdom, but in Europe for many decades, happened post-Brexit. And was that sort of a call or a heed for some kind of a supranational element of democracy and say, listen, you know, we don't like what happened in the referendum, and sort of try to claw back to the European flag. How did you see that from a democratic perspective?
You mean right now what's happening?
Yeah. What's the feeling now? Yeah.
Who remembers Brexit? You know, feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it, Alex? And indeed, in the UK, hardly any mention anywhere, including in the tabloids. But if it is mentioned, you're right. You know, there is some sort of calming down. You know, people instinctively understand in Britain and elsewhere that dealing with something like the pandemic, but requires, you know, small, really very small areas of autonomy. Even not just your nation, London, but Wales, but Oxford, or wherever we are. And yet, at the very same time, when you're trying to research on the vaccine, or when you're trying to procure masks in the world, you know, better to be united. People are quite instinctive about this. So they did ask questions when the British government didn't even work with the EU on certain issues related to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think this is one of the classic issues that we see in so-called traditional democracies. I mean, we get to the point where, you know, everything that's bad comes from Brussels, everything that's good is thanks to me. And even if you look at the rhetoric during the whole crisis, it's been very national in a sense. For instance, in the UK, Boris Johnson's talking about a national crisis, to which I say, excuse me, this is a global crisis. It's not a national crisis. This hits you symmetrically. Of course, the economy is asymmetrically, but the major hit is to everyone. Anne-Marie, let me move into your direction a little bit and sort of to part two. In other words, the sort of democracy during the COVID crisis, and especially from a big tech sort of perspective. And of course, you know, in the beginning, the big tech companies, they were the saviors of freedom, Arab Spring, and the rest of it. Then they went, how would I say, very dark when it came to Cambridge Analytica and the rest of it, and going into privacy and providing data in different types of elections. But how do you see the role of big tech sort of in this post-COVID democratic world?
Well, it certainly has. The techlash has receded in just the way Kalypso said Brexit has receded. The focus on the concentrated power of the tech companies, like everything else, people are focused on what do we need to survive this, so you're seeing a kind of double reaction. On the one hand, the tech companies are more essential than ever. Life has moved online, and we are now clearer than ever that for our democracy to survive, for our educational system to survive, we all need access, universal access to fast and affordable internet. That means essentially moving to the world that the tech companies have been on for some time. Amazon is more important than ever, and it isn't just Amazon, it's all e-retail. Macy's, which I mean, JCPenney rather, one of the biggest retailers, has just declared bankruptcy. Those retail stores were going anyway, but the pandemic has just accelerated their collapse. So that means everybody moves to e-retail, e-education, in ways that really make the tech companies the kind of leaders of this economy. At the same time, there's real concern about warehouse workers for Amazon and the need to really support our essential workers, who are actually mostly our lowest paid workers, many of them also working for e-retailers. And interestingly, when Google and Apple collaborated to create a tracing app, and indeed in Taiwan and South Korea, in Hong Kong, people are using apps on their phones to that can tell who you've been in contact with, and that's going to be an important part of testing and tracing. But most Americans are not interested. I think we'll see more younger Americans willing than older. That's a normal breakdown. But I think it shows you that even in a moment of real crisis, people are very worried about handing over too much to sort of the tech companies and the ability of the tech companies to do what only government should be doing.
Are you at all worried about this notion that we are willing to give up our privacy, sort of to guarantee our security to a certain extent, that people are actually quite cool about, location tracing apps and these kinds of things? Isn't this a big hit for democracy as such and the notion of freedom and privacy?
Well, I think it certainly could be, but already you are seeing civil society come together. There's a tracing contact network of non-governmental organizations that have a set of protocols around what these apps have to do. And above all, there's the need to create a real firewall between the health authorities and the criminal authorities. Now, you can say, well, that's impossible. That's bound to be breached. And certainly many minority communities are going to be even more worried about that than others. At the same time, we're moving to telemedicine and personalized medicine, even independently of the pandemic. And I think people are going to have to live with developing the same civil liberties safeguards online as we have offline, because it's not a choice anymore about whether you move online.
How do you see this, Ivan? I mean, you've been looking at it, you've been studying it. Where is the real balance between freedom and control in a liberal democracy? I mean, is a pendulum swinging in sort of the state control direction at the moment? Does that worry you?
No, it worries me, but at the other side, it's much more understandable. I do believe that there is one tendency which I also find slightly misleading, and this is many people are trying to see this kind of a surveillance, which was the result of trying to control COVID-19, as the second coming of the anti-terrorist legislation.
Mm.
Because honestly, but it is not the same. Because to be honest, some of the people are ready to be traced, not so much to protect themselves. They don't want to infect somebody.
Mm.
And this is a different psychology, and this is why on public health, people are reacting very differently when it comes to their rights. What I find kind of problematic is two other things coming for democracy out of this crisis. Listen, during this crisis, anybody whom you can send home is basically defined as a non-essential institution. And the parliaments were sent home. And from this point of view, I do believe that suddenly, basically, the parliament ended up being viewed by many people as non-essential for how democracy functions. And keeping in mind that, in general, the trust in parliaments was quite low in certain European countries, this is a trend that, in my view, can have a long-term consequences. And secondly, in 1930s, people who really cared about democracy were very much afraid of crowds. And you're going to read all these books about 1930s crowds. During this crisis, and particularly if this social distancing period continues for a longer time, I start to be afraid by the absence of crowds, by the fact that you're not going to have street politics at all. And for me, this is important because there is one aspect of democracy that we're not talking about. Elections about representation, but also about misrepresentation. For example, you who care about certain issues have one vote, and I who don't care much has one vote too. So from this point of view, the street politics is the only way to represent intensity of interest, intensity of sentiment. So this is why for people going on a street is very important for democracy, and it's not by accident that in the last 10 years, we have millions of people in different countries protesting for different things. And I'm not one who is very much in love with protests in general. I don't believe that they're achieving this or that, but this gives the feeling of the people that they know what it means to live in a democracy, because honestly speaking, we have many authoritarian regimes these days that have elections, or their version of elections. What is very easy to understand, do you live in democracy and do you live in an authoritarian country, is not the right to vote, but it is the right to go on the street to protest against the government, to go safely back home. And from this point of view, if you're going to have simply an empty streets for a long time, politically empty, I do believe this can affect very much our understanding of democracy. And from this point of view, digital is not the same. Digital is not the same. It's people being next to each other, people as a collective body. And
but
this is.
Can we have digital democracies, or is democracy a sort of a touchy-feely kind of a thing? In other words, can you bring the crowd into, in Anne-Marie's words, a network, that provides the democratic feeling, or is the online community more a community of a minority where you get shouts and screams and you don't get that touch? I mean, basically, it's a difference between the system 2 and system 1, isn't it? In
Absolutely.
other words, you think crowd is system 2 and the real democracy, and the technology is system 1 and not the real democracy. But can we have a hybrid? Is that possible, Ivan?
No, listen, we are going to have hybrids in everything, starting with cars, and obviously we're going to democracy. And I'm the worst person to be asked this question, because don't forget, I even don't use a mobile phone. So for me, this kind of a move online is quite a radical issue. But there is one important thing. In a certain way, this sense of belonging that being physically part of something gives you cannot be given simply by the digital. And I do believe that the digital can help a lot in the way to rationalize the process and come with the common ideas and so on. But this should be digital plus. And imagine for 6 years not being able to make this distinction. This is the story, because when people said, as a result of COVID-19, we moved towards authoritarianism, to be honest, I'm not buying this very much. Authoritarian leaders does not crisis that they cannot choose on themselves, because any authoritarian leader wants to be God. And God never solves a crisis that he has not created himself. So from this point of view, this is not about this. This is the burning border between democracy and authoritarian regimes that is happening during COVID-19.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point, because if you look at the way in which some of the authoritarian regimes or leaders have dealt with the crisis, say, for instance, Putin, I hesitate to say this, but Donald Trump and perhaps Bolsonaro, they haven't exactly come out of this crisis yet as a champion. Now the jury is out on China. We don't really know the real figures there. But Kalypso, what do you make out of all of this? I mean, do you have a feeling that even in a post-COVID world, we need crowds for democracy to be real?
We always need crowd, as Ivan very brilliantly reminded us. But there are many different ways of being a crowd. Have you seen this beautiful picture of a demonstration in Israel where people demonstrated, against the new settlement, but in boxes with appropriately social distanced, positions. And I think this shows once again what I really truly believe in, which is the wisdom of the crowds. The crowds adapt themselves, and they are multitude in different ways. And what we're seeing today is, a kind of, in a way, a very intense moment, a pedagogical moment of how to be the best crowd possible in COVID. I wrote this little essay on the Eruvian age. The Eruv is how the Jews created spaces where public spaces were transformed into private caring spaces so you could carry on Shabbat. Well, today we are reinventing our spaces to demonstrate, as Ivan was saying, that we care about each other and to make that visible. And we are also debating more intensely than ever, on issues of privacy that Anne-Marie was talking about. What we're seeing is that people understand better that this is a debate between right and right, as often is the case in democracy, that yes, governments and tech firms need our data to fight and kill this virus in many different ways that we know. But at the very same time, what they're asking us is more sensitive data than ever. This is, under the skin data, as Harari would say. And so people start to internalize more than ever all these criteria we all discussed, that it has to be voluntary. I download the app, as Anne-Marie was talking about, anonymous, that what they do should not be arbitrary, that this data is part of the public good, even if it's used by private actors, all of these things. So we are debating very visibly these trade-offs, these tensions. And what I also find extraordinary and fascinating is that we are understanding, I think, better than ever, that democracy is a democracy of everyday life, as Nancy Rosenbaum would say, that it's about how we interact with people around us as crowd, but also as neighborhood. And this is, if you allow me one last point, I've tried to think of this as, in a bit of a provocative way, as our capacity to collectively appropriate R. R, the rate of transmission. It's not going to come down because, governments say so. It's going to be the sum of all of our small individual and group behavior. And so if we are to collectively appropriate it, it's ours, this R. It's the expression of our democratic intensity. Maybe we're inventing something like societal mindfulness, not just individual mindfulness.
I think, Kalypso, that's a really good point. One of the ways in which I've tried to put it is to say that, the three of us, or the four of us, we're basically information managers, right? So we put numbers and letters into coherent structures and try to do two things with them. One, understand the world, and two is to try to make the world a better place. I make this presumption that we're trying to do that. And the instruments that we use are twofold. One is our voice as we're speaking, and the other one is the written word. Now, if and when technology is developing to the stage whereby algorithms can start doing a lot of the stuff that we do in a better way than we actually can, I think there's one thing that's left for us, and that's empathy. And by that, I mean the way in which we interact as human beings. And my question is, and here is, I think, where I find a mutual ground between all three of you, is that actually this crisis has woken us up to a new reality that, this Zoom stuff is pretty cool and it's nice to be home. But at the same time, we start missing that sort of, how would I say, touchy feeling of democracy as well. So therefore, I move to our sort of third part of the conversation. And I guess I start posing this question to all of you, that do you see this as a demise, the potential beginning of the end of democracy? Or do you see it as the beginning of a new type of democracy? Because, of course, you're going to have people saying that, listen, China is doing much better in this crisis than traditional democracies are. Again, I don't take that argument for face value, but that's one of the arguments. So where will COVID take democracy and the future of democracy? Anne-Marie, if I may start with you.
Well, gazing into my crystal ball, I think we're headed, at least in the United States, for a renewal of our democracy. And we were heading in that direction even before COVID. I think COVID will accelerate that change. But in the United States, it's less about, it's about democracy, but it's really about representation. Right now, a majority of Americans want many things, from sensible gun control, at least bans on assault rifles, to the ability of a woman to choose, at least in her first trimester, to some kind of sensible climate policy. There are any number of areas where you can show by good polling that really a majority of Americans want something. And yet, our electoral system does not allow us to achieve it. And that has been increasingly clear. I think it will be even clearer as we come out of what happens here in terms of a response to COVID. I think you're going to see really big differences between the governed states and the worst governed states, and you're going to see that the federal government has basically been paralyzed by our polarization. Some response, yes, on the economic side, but at least for the first couple rounds. We'll see what happens here. But the ideal would have been to have a national strategy, a national testing board, use of national capabilities to create the supply lines we need. We haven't had that. So I think we are due for major democratic reforms. We had them 100 years ago when we changed the way we elected senators and we moved to primaries from conventions. I think this time around we'll see a move to something like ranked choice voting. Whether, we may still call it liberal democracy, but the liberal democracy that exists today is very different than the liberal democracy that existed 100 years ago. And if you go 100 years before that, most of us wouldn't call it a democracy because the franchise was so limited. And yet we still would talk about, in this country, 250 years of democracy. So the labels, I think, are less important, but the enduring need of real representation and a balance between public voice and effective governance, where you have to be able to get things done, is one that is continually being redressed and certainly needs redressing in the United States right now.
No, thanks, Anne-Marie. And I should say here in between that we have a few hundred people online watching this, and we're all grateful for that. And there are a lot of questions coming in, and I will take those a little bit towards the end. Ivan, let me pose the same question. Is this the beginning of the end of democracy? If you look at Freedom House, if you look at all the different analysis of the 200 nation states around the world, are we going to see more democracies or less democracies or different kinds of democracies as a result of this crisis?
Well, listen, I very much agree with Anne-Marie. We are redefining every time what democracy means. And normally this crisis is not so much changing things, but showing us how much the thing has changed. By the way, there is a famous psychological experiment where you are showing in a very quick order to a person pictures of a cat. And then suddenly after 3 or 4 cats, you put a picture of a dog. And you're asking the person all the time, what do you see? And he's saying cats, cats. And then suddenly somebody shouting his or her name. And the moment you're distracted and you're back to the pictures, you start to see dogs also. And I do believe this is part of the crisis. There are many things that have been there. You start to see them. By the way, one of the diminishing role of the parliament was there. It was not created by this crisis. It was because of the new information environment. Secondly, different generations have a different idea what democracy means for them. For certain generations, you're going to allow different kind of intervention in your privacy or not. It's very difficult to expect that young people, which are telling everything about themselves on the Facebook, should be as worried about privacy as the older generations that basically, particularly in Eastern Europe, that believes that any kind of outside view on your private life is a threat for you. So I do believe we're going to have to see all these changes. And also, one point which for me is important, we expect that as a result of it, the world is going to move in a certain direction. And my feeling is that different places are going to move in different directions. I still remember a children's book that were talking about some lord who get out of the room, jump on his horse, and rode off in all directions at the same time. And I do believe this is going to happen. We are going to see a very different kind of outcomes of the COVID-19 experience in different countries. Even in Europe, you're going to see as a result of it, countries which get a much more confidence in their governments and much more confidence how democracy works in the emergencies. And then you have countries that have a very different experience than this. So I don't believe that this is kind of a 1989 moment in which we are going to say democracy has won or authoritarianism has won. I do believe we're going to have a kind of a type of a very pluralistic outcome.
Yeah, and so you could basically talk about, I don't know, messy democracy or complex democracy and go in all. And I think we could actually see this already in the sort of post-2008 financial crisis, because we were used to fairly, how would I argue, clear election results. You know, in two-party systems, it was evenly split. In coalition governments, you had traditional coalitions. But then suddenly, after the crisis, you start to get populist movements. Traditional parties were going down, and this is, I guess, the beauty of democracy as well. And let me add on. I mean, I agree with you on the role of the parliament as well. And I've been saying this a long time. Of course, I was on the executive side for 8 years in government. And if you have a clear majority backing the government, then usually the parliament functions as someone who approves the legislator, the laws. Yeah. But it's the executive that actually decides. I think the exception to this, by the way, is the European Parliament, which I still see as a powerhouse. I always say that a European parliamentarian who, for instance, gets an important legislative report, he has more or she has more power than a national minister. So the European parliamentarian's job is lovely, because basically you have a lot of power but very little responsibility, or that responsibility comes only every 5 years. But
it's very hopeful when you say that it's going to be messy. It's now East European times coming. We love messiness.
That's absolutely fine. How do you see this, Kalypso? I mean, if you look at the sort of European landscape, one of the questions that have come in for you specifically is on Poland and Hungary, and I know we focus on those two quite a lot. And the more specific question is that, should Article 7 be pressed on Poland and Hungary? Are they democracies anymore? What's going on here? I mean, I know a dictator when I see one, and I've seen many, and I don't see dictatorships in Hungary or Poland. But what's your take on this?
Well, that's the thing. We should send you, Alex, to talk with Orban and Kaczynski, and it will be.
I don't think they want to see me anymore,
and indeed, when we're thinking about democracy, your question in general, let's not try to predict too much, because we're right in the middle of this messy story. And, we all tend to project our worst nightmares, but also our desires to the afterworld. And in my kind of, desire, and I'll come to Poland and Hungary, but I think that you spoke about empathy. I'd like to think that our democracies, but also the EU, is about institutionalizing empathy. You can't always count on it as an instinct. How do you institutionalize it? Through the law. And that's not altruism. So the big debate we're having in Europe today about whether we can have solidarity between democracies that each do their thing. Can I trust you to give you more money as a Corona fund or even a Corona bond if you're Italy? This is about institutionalizing empathy. This is about understanding your circumstances. This is about rethinking all these things about moral hazard in a way which takes into account the realities, the very complex differences between us. So there's this institutionalization of empathy, and it's very important in a context where we have to remind ourselves that democracy cannot happen without shared concern for economic justice. What this pandemic is showing is that there are huge amounts of people that were precarious before the crisis, not just the poorest. Many of our young, people are. And this has exploded. So that's the first point. The second point is very much about Anne-Marie's point on, the states and the right balance. We all hope, when we've seen the way climate change was dealt with, we could all see that multi-centric governance, having many actors contribute to the goal, the growl, is very important. So you need to connect all of these things. And I think that, we will see that in the post-COVID-19 world, we will be caring much more about how we can learn from each other. In France, it's fascinating that this is happening between regions. There's this big debate between the Girondins and the Jacobins, and what kind of democracy works best in a pandemic. So that's fascinating. And finally, I also wanted to pick up on Ivan's point on change, because what I'm hoping the great paradox is that we may enter a world where finally we understand that democracy has to be about the long term, and that the EU can be the guardian of the long term, that democracy have a problem of short-termism. And so resilience, future crisis, is about this caring. That's the comparative advantage of EU democracy. Which brings us all the way back to Hungary and Poland, because at the end of the day, we've been jumping up and down, rightly so. Maybe I'm a bit more tough than you, Alex, that, these leaders have used the opportunity, as with any crisis, to clamp down on the rule of law, to consolidate their power, to spank their opposition or dissident voices. We've seen all of this more than ever. But at the end of the day, Article 7 is an old debate. Yes, that's the nuclear button for the EU when it comes to rule of law and democracy problems in the member states. And probably there needs to be much more naming and shaming, probably some conditionality on monies, at least locally. But at the end of the day, there's a fascinating thing happening in these countries, which is the return of all the young people who were with us in Oxford or in Britain or elsewhere, who are coming back to their countries and are going to be much more demanding. So at the end of the day, democracy is about the body politics. And that's made of all these young people. And this is them that we need to empower rather than necessarily always focus on the head.
That was good. I really like the notion of institutional empathy. And of course, we're moving towards US presidential elections, and the debate is ample over there. And perhaps empathy is not the word that one would sort of associate with the current president of the United States. But Anne-Marie, what's your feeling? What's going to be the state of democracy in the US after the presidential elections? Are we going to go back to normal, or has the US changed forever?
I think the biggest worry many of us have is that this will look like the 2000 election, where it's close in many states, and there's far less trust in government than there was even in 2000. And in 2000, it's been a steady decline since the 1960s. But really, there's a deep worry, one that I share, that President Trump will not accept the results of an election, anything other than something that is really uncontested. And I don't see that. I see many places where there's a tremendous amount of voter suppression. I see a lot of fighting already over vote by mail, and it's already being politicized. And you saw the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court wouldn't allow Wisconsin to extend the election date for more vote by mail. So before we can get to democracy on the other side of this election, many of us are extremely worried that this election will not be a clean one, and that we will be fighting the results of it possibly for months, which is, I think, a real and present threat to our democracy. I don't want to over dramatize, but it's real.
Yeah, I remember distinctly the election where there was a standoff between Al Gore and George W. Bush, mainly about the vote count in Florida. And of course, the American system was very resilient. It sort of stood out. But the interesting thing is that there's a debate in America about whether you can vote through mail, when in a small country like Estonia, they've been voting through internet, already for quite a few years. And this is a big debate. I always used to say, let's go for the internet vote, but it's not a self-evident thing either. There are a lot of wonderful questions coming in here online. Thank you, Constanza Hermanin. Thank you, Carlos Closa. Thank you, Peter Markovic, Luca Muscara. And then a person who I used for my PhD in the good old days, Lisbeth Huge. She asks a question here, and perhaps I can throw this at Ivan first. She says, okay, future democracy, China or transnational? So can you separate the fate of democracy or democratic revival from A, the ascent of China, which is not a democracy, and by the way, ain't going to become a democracy, we can forget that, and B, the retreat of transnational interactions?
This is a great question. And there was also kind of a strange paradox with this COVID-19. On one level, we have never been living more in a common world ever before. And this is so easy. You stay at your home, you go through a television channels, most of the languages you don't know, but if you're on the primetime news, you know what they're talking about. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
So from this point of view, you get all these cosmopolitans, but on the other side, the message of this very important type of a crisis was stay home. And that's come the story. Where is home? And home is not every places in which you have apartments or every places that you have been working in. And I do believe one of the things that is going to stay as the result of this crisis is that if yesterday, before this happened, you're going to ask all of us the question, what is the crisis you believe can save globalization? And if we can choose between war or even great migration and pandemic, we're going to say pandemic, because there is no clash between states, it's common, it's about science, and it doesn't work. And I do believe escalation in the US-China rivalry that you see as a result of this crisis is going to affect everything. By the way, you're back in a situation in which every type of a great power competition starts to be framed as a political, ideological. Nevertheless, that of course I don't believe that we're back to the Cold War simply because Soviet Union was not a capitalist country, which China is. And for Europe, this is also a major issue, because I was seeing the results of a still unpublished survey of the European Council on Foreign Relations in 12 EU member states. You're going to be shocked by two data. I do believe much more expectedly you're going to see the rise of the anti-China sentiments in most of the EU member states.
Okay.
But then you're going to see the collapse of the image of the United States. And honestly speaking, this is not only about Trump. This is about seeing a dysfunctional country, a broken country, and also for the Europeans, this is the version of 100 Days of Solitude. Suddenly, Europeans discovered its loneliness. Loneliness as a person, also, to be honest, in many countries as a nation state, but also as Europeans. On the question whom you can rely after the crisis, the US does not come then more than 5% in any of the countries. And we're talking about also countries like Poland or others, which are traditionally very much pro-American. So I do believe, and I agree very much with the question, that geopolitics is also going to change the way we also defining what it is and what is not.
Yeah, I think even that's a razor sharp analysis. And given that we have 6 minutes left in this, I'm going to throw the big final question to the three of you, which is actually linked to a book that I'm working on. This is a commercial break. It is called Digital Democracy or Digital Dictatorship, the struggle for global power between China, the US, and Europe. You guys know me, I'm a strong, avid pro-European and transatlanticist, but let me frame the question like this. If these are the three main powers that will basically try to fill the power vacuums in a post-COVID world, and if we see a clear tension and a word feud, to put it diplomatically, between China and the United States, and if two of these are democracies and one is not, what should the European Union do in all of this? I'll give you my answer after you guys have answered. In other words, who should Europe play ball with and how far? Kalypso, why don't you start?
Well, if I'm a good mainstream Brusselite these days, I would say, well, we continue to believe in transatlantic friendship and solidarity. Yes, Ivan, we are in a world of geopolitical solitude, but we feel less lonely on the Atlantic side. After all, there's still so much we share. And I think I agree with Anne-Marie that there's enough resilience in US democracy for Europeans to say that. Doesn't mean we want to go all the way to the US. Yes, we're trying to continue to be a mediator with China, including in the reform of global governance and all of this. The world needs Europe as a mediator, absolutely. But at the end of the day, this is kind of a bit of the, wishy-washy Euro speak. And we might have to make harder choices because, we haven't talked about this, but you talk about digital democracy. More generally, the great technologies, what people call the quantum singularity, the idea that the race between those two is to master putting together, quantum computing, big data, and the internet. And that will be the key to power. The problem is that the EU is absent from that race. And it may mean that we have to choose, or magic, Alex, you find a way for us Europeans to actually step back into the race. And hopefully, you know, this COVID moment where European scientists have been quite, you know, extraordinary, you know, means that we can mobilize as Europeans for the sake of democracy, where the stakes are huge.
Anne-Marie, what's your take? What should Europe do in this? I think Anne-Marie needs to be unmuted from the main office because there's a slight buzzing sound.
I just
unmuted.
I unmuted. I was just heading off the noise of one of my sons clattering down the stairs. So I would say two things. And one is a partial response to Elizabeth Hoch's very good question, which is, all of us do, well, I won't speak for China, but the United States and Europe do both need to pay more attention to what is happening at home. So we're not going to undo globalization completely. Nothing. It's really quite impossible for many of the reasons that Ivan said. But certainly in the United States, one of the reasons our reputation is sinking is because anyone can look at the league tables of advanced countries and see that we're coming at the bottom in education, in healthcare, in maternal mortality, in science and technology, and not our companies, but our educational system. So we have to fix what is wrong with us at home. And I think there's a real advantage in rebalancing so that, of course, we are still linked, but we really are thinking we need to bring some of those supply chains home to increase our resilience. We need to focus really intensively domestically. But here's the point on, if I were advising Europe, I would say many of us have spent a lot of time building up the EU as a unitary entity with the euro and the EU as one, as a superpower. But if you take a transnational view of the world, and we are indeed at the School of Transnational Governance, I would disaggregate to look at the major European cities and who their mayors are, to look at various provinces and who their leaders are, to look at universities and where they are. If you look at that, Europe is deeply, deeply networked. Not only, obviously, the EU itself, but look at the ties that the European scientific establishments and companies have globally. Look at the mayors, look at the governors, and think about Europe as a transnational hub. It plays deeply around the world.
No, I think that's a very good point. And of course, that's one of the big issues that you've raised in your books on networks and on transnational governance as well. Ivan, I'll give you the final word. What should Europe do here between China and the United States?
Alex, you're writing the book on this. Get the final word.
I don't want to reveal my thesis, but it's pretty close to the argument that I think 75% the United States, 25% China. So try to do some geopolitical mediation in between, but know who your true friends are. And they're usually across the Atlantic. So ladies and gentlemen, and dear panelists, we're coming towards an end. And I would really like to thank personally Anne-Marie, Ivan, and Kalypso for joining us. This was our first stab at a 7 webinar series. And the next one, please join us. It's going to be actually Monday next week. And if I recall, again, 5 o'clock Central European time. And it will be moderated by my friend and colleague, George Papakonstantinou, who was the former finance minister of Greece when I was only the foreign minister of Finland. So we didn't cross tables at the time, but we do have a couple of ouzos and vodkas around the different themes the time. And he will be joined by Jean Pisani-Ferry and Bridget Laffen, who is one of my teachers and mentors and runs the Robert Schuman Center. I will end on a positive note, which is linked to social distancing. You see, here in Finland, we're a little bit shy. And when a Finn is told that in the future, remember, you will have to keep a 2-meter distance to everyone. We turn around and look, why that close? With these words, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very nice evening and a good week coming ahead. And I'm sure democracy will prevail at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.